in this discussion. I've looked at the list of registrants. I can see who's participating, and it's a number of very familiar names, each of whom has behind him or her a long record of commitment to the community, and specifically a commitment to the Roundtable and to the continuing efforts to foster racial justice. I'm a self-proclaimed member of the choir, and I'm so proud that I sing so well. But of the several things I have learned in the most recent months is that, notwithstanding my pride in being a member of the choir and my pride in the choir as a whole, the truth of the matter is that the songs the choir has been singing simply have not moved the ball sufficiently. And what I really have learned is that even I, the inimitable Judge Tim Black, needs to stop talking and start listening. I thought I was listening, but I need to listen more effectively, and I need to take action. So I am thrilled to be a part of this today. I'm so excited by who the presenters are and who the people are who have been on the laboring oar putting this together. It's young people. I'm at a point in my life and my career where the dust and the journey and the grit of the journey, I can feel it in my bones, and I need help. The community needs help, and it properly rests in the up and coming youthful leadership with which we are so blessed. And so today, I'm going to try not to talk. I'm going to try and listen. And I'm going to try not to immediately reach the obvious conclusion that what I think, based on what I've heard, must be right. I'm going to let it permeate me and percolate. And then in due course, I want to join with you and act. This cannot be a one-off opportunity. We have so much work to do. And yet we have such strong people dedicated together to moving the ball forward that I find hope. So to all of you who are participating, and particularly to the panelists who are presenting, thank you. Judge, I'm going to try and stop talking. The floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. And with the permission of my co-convener, who I really admire and enjoy every Black participating with, I have share with him. I'm going to go a little bit longer, and hopefully I won't take too much time. But I want to thank all of you for joining us, and all of you for your commitment to racial equality, especially as it relates to the practice of law. But I'm going to talk a little bit about a personal note. At 325 US 91, you will find a case deeply personal to me. The case is Screws versus the United States. And in those pages, the High Court ruled that the fatal beating of my uncle, Robert Bobby Hall, at the hands of a Georgia sheriff, Claude Screws, under color of state law, was not an intentional deprivation of his civil rights. The life of Bobby Hall mattered to my family. And as a child, I vividly recall my mother and grandmother talking about and still grieving over the loss and the heartfelt pain associated with his death. The lives of all Black persons matter. So more than 30 years ago, the founders of BLAC-CBA Roundtable, Judges Jones and Robert L. Black, Tim's uncle, shouldered the challenge that the greater Cincinnati legal community faced, namely its lack of progress in hiring and retention and accession to partnership of Black and brown lawyers and law firms, and in the elevation of these folks to state and federal court judgeships. And in January, as we mourn the loss of Judge Jones, the last of these two great champions, a sad reality came over me. Then I realized, as a nation and as a state and community, some 30 years later, we find ourselves today still segregated, more so now than Brown. When Brown was decided 60 years ago, still two Americas, one Black, one white, separate and unequal, and still lagging in fairness and opportunity for all Americans in our legal system. Cicero, the great Roman citizen, philosopher, and lawyer, had a famous quote, often repeated by Benjamin E. Mays, former president of Morehouse College, that reads, "To be ignorant of what occurred before you were born is to remain always a child." So the challenge we face today as well-meaning members of the bar concerned about the common good are these. Number one, we must take the time to educate ourselves, our partners, our associates, and even our family members and friends about the role race has and continues to play in American society. The organizers of today's events, which I laud as Judge Black did, have done a marvelous job, have helped by providing us with a reading list that reveal the untold story of racism and the institutionalization of racism in our country and how it's led to many of the gross disparities in our economic and judicial systems. Number two, we must become vigilant and appeal to our better angels as we relate to the persons who differ from ourselves based upon such artificial distinctions as skin color, gender, sexual orientation, cultural background, among other items. And number three, we must become activists, not silent observers. As Dr. King held, the time is always right to do what is right. From the founding of our nation, lawyers have always been seen as leaders, or in the words of Charles Hamilton Houston, social engineers. It is well time for us to take up this cause again and become the leaders in our nation for promoting racial equality. Lest we feel that all things are equal in the world, we include in your reading list recent articles taken from the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post relating to stories from several C-suite executives of color, senior vice presidents at Google, Target, Otis Elevator, and other industries who, until now, have been reluctant to share their experiences. Why? Because as persons of color who are professionals, we must rise above and soldier on beyond the thousand cuts just to perform at our level best. In this world of visual effect, momentarily you will see and hear how and why unconscious bias, or dare I say, conscious racial discrimination invades our thoughts, our words, and our deeds on a daily basis and helps to perpetuate certain disparities. Every African-American lawyer has his or her own story evidencing starkly different treatment compared to our white counterparts. One might ask, how does this manifest itself? One need only go no further than the work assignment. Who gets the right work? Who's placed in the right departments? Second, mentoring and training. Who gets one-on-one attention and training? Is it someone who looks like yourselves? And lastly, the invitation to join. Who gets invited to lunch, to coffee, to golfing, to dinner parties? In our collective experience, most African-American attorneys can easily predict which new attorneys in private or public practice are going to be successful. Those individuals receive the right assignments, the right mentors, the best mentoring, and importantly, are given the benefit of the doubt when a project flops. And these too are the individuals who get invited. I think I speak for the roundtable when I say that it is not our purpose here to preach to the choir, as Judge Black has said, or to just identify the problem without proposing solutions. That is what today's CLE is meant to bring about, a continuation of the conversation and hard work begun by our founders for the sake of our city and our profession. We cannot allow this to be a one-off moment. Today's program must be a first step, or better stated, a next step towards the change we want to become, as envisioned by our founders, Robert Black and Judge Jones. During this watershed moment and building on our legacy, let us envision greater Cincinnati as a legal community that becomes the envy, indeed the model for our nation. Here are some suggested tools. Talk about race and racism with your partners and associates and family, but only after you've taken the time to educate yourselves from the reading list provided, and do so in mixed company. Volunteer, tutor, or merely speak at an inner city K-12 school. Be a role model. Kids have never seen folks like you who are lawyers. Support SWELL, LOI, or similar pipeline programs that help prepare children of color for the rigors of the legal or other professions. Speak up. like my co-convener Tim Black does, when the moment lends itself, in order to promote racial equality in hiring, retention, and advancement. The NFL has the Rooney Rule. What's our rule? Write your senators and tell them that the time is long past for there to be the appointment of Cincinnati's first Black district court judge. We bear the dubious distinction of being the only major city in Ohio who hasn't. Denounce racist attitudes and behaviors wherever and whenever you encounter them, even when it's hard, like when you're among friends and family. And finally, we are asking that you join in the Roundtable's 30-year effort to promote equal justice and to make our profession more egalitarian and representative of the population. And with that, I yield the floor to Mike Hawkins, who will introduce our first presenter, Ms. Amber Smith.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Michael Hawkins, partner at Dinsmore, past president of the Cincinnati Bar Association, member of the Cincinnati Bar Diversity and Inclusion Committee. I also have served as past chair of the Cincinnati Human Relations Commission, and I am a member of BLAC and a proud supporter. To introduce the first presentation today, in an effort to inspire us all to greater engagement, we need to understand how we got where we are and the reality of the racial inequities in society. This is a focus for lawyers. I think it's important to remember that 25 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence and 32 of the 55 framers of the Constitution were all lawyers. In the Army, I learned, number one, to embrace the challenge, number two, to be calm in the midst of chaos, and number three, to acknowledge that you get what you expect. So let's all embrace the challenge faced by these racial inequities. Let's be calm so that we can effectively process what we're about to learn and can learn and should continue learning. And let's leave here and set a tone within our respective spheres of influence that you get what you expect from yourself and from others. It's now my honor to introduce Amber Smith, who will take us on this educational journey to inspire us and make us think about how we may participate. Amber grew up in a suburb of Milwaukee. She attended Hampton University, an historic Black university in Virginia. There, she explored her interest in politics and civil rights. In fact, she had the opportunity to introduce Michelle Obama in a 2012 campaign stop there. She also volunteered while she was at Hampton to go to Ghana, and when there was further inspired to dedicate her efforts towards human rights. Upon graduation from Hampton, she was accepted and participated at the prestigious Georgetown Law School, where she excelled. In addition, while there, she continued her volunteer efforts and taught human rights and criminal justice in DC high schools. She also had the opportunity to travel to South Africa and Kenya, and I particularly look forward to catching up with her on these Africa trips, as I've had the opportunity to go to Ghana with the Red Cross, Kenya with Refugees International, and a special trip with Judge Jones to South Africa after the end of apartheid. Upon graduation from Georgetown and participation in other activities such as leadership in the Women of Color Collective, Amber came here to Cincinnati and joined Dinsmore, where she succeeded in the corporate department. And then she pursued the path that she's on today as Director of Voter Protection with the Ohio Democratic Party, where she has been able to marry her passion for human rights and political strategy on a daily basis. So we turn it over now to Amber, who's put together what I think, and I think everybody on our team agrees, is a great presentation and should inspire and educate us all. Amber?
Thank you, Mike. for that warm introduction. And thank you to our co-conveners for their ongoing commitment to racial justice, both in our community and our legal profession, both here and beyond. I'd also like to thank the subcommittee for this portion of the event, for their trust in my ability to present on their behalf, and for their input throughout the preparation for today's presentation. And finally, I'd like to thank each and every one of you who are here today as a part of this conversation. You could have joined any Zoom call in America, but you decided to log into this one this morning, and so I'm very appreciative. So as you can imagine, this conversation today is time sensitive, not only because of how pressing the issue of racial justice is, but because we have an amazing program planned for you today. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. As you can see in the chat, any questions you have about my portion of the presentation, please do your best to reserve them till the end, either by placing them in the chat, using the chat function, or simply writing them down. There will be Q&A at the end of today's program. All right, so you all should still be able to see me as a thumbnail in the top right corner of your screen, or whichever place you decide to move the thumbnail. And so just to begin, so today we will be discussing, particularly at this portion of the event, what we can all do as individuals. All right, so we'll begin today's discussion with a poll question. And so Kate is gonna go ahead and populate that. So the question is simply, as of June 2020, what percentage of American adults expressed some or strong support for the Black Lives Matter movement? So you'll see the different options. Please just take a moment to choose your option. And while we won't linger on this for too long, it will definitely come into play as we continue during today's conversation. And just as you determine your answer, if you'll notice, this is actually an image of the Black Lives Matter mural that was recently painted right outside of our City Hall here in Cincinnati. All right, so thank you all so much for participating in the poll. And so it looks like we have a majority of folks who got the right answer. So in 2020 America, surprisingly enough, 67% of American adults expressed at least some or strong support for the ongoing Black Lives Matter movement. All right, so before we delve into why we're here today, and particularly what we can do as individuals, I think it's important that we begin by discussing some overarching themes that not only apply to today's discussion, but also the overall fight for racial justice. So when I think about any opportunity that I've had to grow, it has always come hand in hand with a certain level of discomfort. And so the diagram on the screen right now, the Venn diagram, really helps to illustrate why that's so important. And it's because, you know, the process of unlearning some of our inhibiting beliefs and really acknowledging the way that it's important to embrace change, even when it's uncomfortable, really carries weight in this particular conversation. So we want to make sure that as we move through today's topics and have an honest conversation about race, we are getting comfortable with discomfort. I think we also want to make sure that we're exercising empathy and grace, not only for others, but for ourselves. When we talk about issues of racial injustice in our community and in our nation, a lot of times it can invoke feelings of guilt and shame, particularly for those who feel as if they have been perpetrators of racial discrimination, whether intentionally or unintentionally. But what I have found is that guilt and shame are not the most productive of feelings, and we really want to make sure that we're exercising that empathy and grace so that we're not being overburdened by those feelings. We also want to embrace creativity and optimism. When I think about the ongoing struggle for racial justice, I think about all the ways that throughout history people have used what they had at their disposal to fight, and to do so with what President Obama coined as the audacity of hope. And so we want to make sure that we're embracing that today. I think it's also important that we are solution oriented. So I don't know about you, but I became an attorney with the intent of solving problems. And for some reason, it seems like race in America is just one of those things that have really stumped not just the legal community, but all Americans. But I think that we are really well positioned to champion the cause in a solution oriented way. And then finally, we want to make sure that we're leading with love. When you're talking about things like this, that again evokes feelings of guilt and shame for all those affected by racial injustice, you'll have to think about what's really at stake here. And really it is the people and the communities that are burdened by discrimination. And so we want to make sure that we're leading with a sense of love for them and for their overall destiny. All right. So today, in order to really foster a dialogue about how to fight for racial justice, we're going to focus on 7 ways in particular that we can do so. So these 7 ways are simply to educate ourselves, and not just about anything, right? About particularly where we are as a nation and as a community, and then how we got here. So in order to do this, I will be, giving a sort of a primer on racial history and the status quo here in America. But of course, we want to remember that this is by no means an exhaustive story of racial injustice in this country. We want to make sure that we're continuing that education for ourselves. And then, as Judge Black mentioned during his introduction, we want to make sure that we're listening, and not just in order to prepare a rebuttal, as us attorneys are sometimes very great at doing, but to do so with the intent of really giving space and a platform to those, especially victims and survivors of discrimination. And then we want to engage. Once we've done the work of educating ourselves, which is a continuous process, and we've listened to people's stories and given them opportunities to share them and define themselves for themselves, we also want to make sure that we're engaging around these issues in thoughtful, solution-oriented ways. And I'll show some examples of how to do that. And then, as one of the more meaningful ways that we can engage, we want to align with existing organizations. And where we find that there are voids to be filled, then that's when we want to perhaps look into creating our own organizations, right? But first and foremost, we want to make sure that we're aligning and supporting those organizations that have already existed and are already doing the work. And then we want to talk about leveraging our individual power. A lot of times the conversation about racial injustice focuses on privilege and unfair disadvantage that's assigned to different groups of people. And so as a result, certain people have power more so than others when it comes to fighting racial justice. So we want to make sure that we're leveraging that power. All right. Oh, and then finally, our last 2 points, we want to make sure that we're celebrating Black people, communities, and culture. I think, sometimes this gets left out of the conversation, but again, when we think about how can we really keep the focus in terms of what we're fighting for, celebrating Black people, communities, and culture is a great way to do that. I think it's also then important, finally, that we're bold in all of these things, because of course, fighting for racial justice in this country and even today continues to present its own share of risks. So when we talk about educating ourselves, I think it's first and foremost important to acknowledge the fact that we have to take responsibility for our own understanding of how and why race defines our lived experiences. So for the next 15 to 20 minutes, I will really delve into certain information that I think is essential to really begin the journey towards being a racial justice advocate or continue the work you've already been doing. But I think that as our co-conveners mentioned, and as you all have received in your materials for today, there are so many resources that you can rely on to educate yourself and to educate others. And so really taking on that onus for yourself. I think it's also important that we acknowledge the ways that sometimes the burden has been shifted onto communities of color and to Black communities to do this work. And that is problematic for a number of reasons, the least of which are not that all Black people and all people of color are not necessarily experts on championing racial justice. And so when we shift that burden, we take the risk of challenging people who are ill-equipped for that challenge, and also individuals who hold varying perspectives on this topic, right? So when we're educating ourselves, we want to make sure that we are doing the work of listening to the diversity of voices on the topic, and able to really make an informed decision about where we stand on these issues. And then finally, we want to make sure that we understand that race-based discrimination is a traumatic thing for those who experience it. And even for those who have perpetrated throughout history. So, as we continue to educate ourselves, let's just remember that when we shift the burden onto others, we threaten to re-traumatize them around some of these issues, particularly those victims and survivors of racial inequality. So I think, it's very important that we start with the notion that we have to first understand where we are, right, and how we got here in order to champion this cause effectively. So when we think about where we are, we have to understand that racial disparity in America really permeates every system, right? So a lot of times as attorneys, we're focused on the criminal legal system, which Mr. Singleton is going to do an amazing job of discussing and really going into depth about. But really it permeates through every system, not just the criminal legal system. So we want to be conscious of this, especially as advocates, so that we're making sure that we're not trivializing the struggle for racial justice. I think it's also very important that while we're talking about how we can champion racial justice as individuals, that we're also understanding the way that it impacts our profession. So while we champion it in our individual capacity, we also have to understand that as folks that are particularly situated within the legal profession, that we have a particular responsibility and we have an opportunity to create change within the profession. And so when we look at legal employment, and let's note that this is not just about lawyers, right? This is about all occupations. So arbitrators, mediators, court reporters, and even paralegals, right, are wildly underrepresented in different communities. And we see that the white community really overrepresents the legal field, is overrepresented in the legal field. So just keep that in mind. And then a study that actually just came out and was published by the ABA in June of this year, so just last month, really focuses on how the majority, I believe 70% of minority female lawyers have considered leaving the law and the legal profession altogether on account of their sense of exclusion and a lack of recognition for their contributions to the field. And then when we look at healthcare, we want to acknowledge the ways that African Americans are more likely to die at earlier ages for all causes, right? So high blood pressure, diabetes, stroke, and even what the CDC acknowledges is gun violence, particularly among African-American children, right? And that's not just at the hands of police, but within our communities are more likely to die from all these different interrelated causes that are oftentimes caused by the socioeconomic factors burdening Black and Brown communities. And so really just taking, understanding this, and also that African-Americans are less likely to feel like they can go to a doctor to receive preventative care because of cost. So briefly, I will touch on the criminal legal system in this context, just to talk about also how, as Cincinnatians, you have to understand the way that racial injustice impacts us. So some of you all may be familiar with Wadajin Pratt, who is actually a University of Cincinnati professor of piano and was an artist in residence when he spoke about his experience actually here in Cincinnati, but also across America. And, you know, I think a lot of times when we think about the criminal legal system, we think about some of the more insidious ways, right? Or some of the more visible ways that injustice plays out in the incarceration rates of people of color and Black people in particular. But Awadajin really speaks about an issue that he coins and so many of us refer to as driving while Black, right? And this idea that he has been stopped countless times by police for minor, if any, traffic violations, including by the University of Cincinnati campus police for failing to use a turn signal while pulling onto a one-way street. And during his discussion of his experience, which can be found at the link that's included and is also included in your materials for today, he harkens back to the story of Sam DuBose, who many of us know was killed at the hands of University of Cincinnati police officer Ray Tenzing in 2017, and really sparked outcries of racial injustice here in our city. But again, that was a situation where Sam DuBose was stopped for a minor traffic infraction. And so we want to really acknowledge the ways, you know, that this is not just an American issue. This is also an issue right here in our communities. And so I wanted to particularly touch on this point because as an attorney, I've had the privilege of working with clients who are entering and venturing into the hemp and marijuana space, which of course we know is a major opportunity, right, for business owners and things of that nature interested in this space, not just for medical but recreational purposes now. But because there's not, you know, a federal mandate to legalize and decriminalize marijuana and hemp, or particularly marijuana, hemp is federally legal. we're still seeing the disparate treatment of African Americans in this context. And again, David will go further into those disparities around arrests and particularly within the context of drug use. But really, this just illustrates some of those ongoing dilemmas that communities are faced in this current climate. But of course, that is a summary of really the state of racial disparity in this country before the pandemic, right? So that was recent history without the onset of the coronavirus. So now we see, and what many of us have realized, is that the pandemic has merely exacerbated so many of these issues that our community has faced. So when we look at economics and employment within the context of the coronavirus, we see that Black workers are more likely than others to be in frontline jobs, making them more exposed to contracting the virus. And that while unemployment has skyrocketed for Black and white workers in this current labor market, unemployment rate is disproportionately higher for Black workers. And so when we look at the rates and how things have exploded, in a negative way over the course of the last few months even, and we look at even when we break it down by gender, how those disparities are more pronounced. And so here we see that there's a disparate understanding of what it means to be safe in this environment. And we even see that age-adjusted COVID-19 hospitalization rates by race show a disproportionate impact on communities of color. And that first statistic relates to American Indians, but that second number is African Americans or Black people in this country, whereas that final statistic that shows a much lower rate of hospitalization among white Americans really illustrates the disparities during this current climate. And when you think about hospitalization, you think about having the worst symptoms as it relates to COVID-19. And so again, that fear of getting preventative care and that fear of getting adequate care once you arrive still exists and is more pronounced. And so in the context of this pandemic, we are also still seeing police and even vigilante violence occur against Black communities. And so when we think about Ahmaud Arbery, which was one of the, a killing that occurred in March of this year, and we know that his killers actually were not arrested for some time until after, and these were civilians, right, who were affiliated with the local police force. But it really just illustrates the connection between sometimes what we see as a lack of accountability on behalf of those who harm communities of color. And then also we see images of the Amy Cooper situation that happened in Central Park, where the police were weaponized against a Black park goer who was honestly calling her out for actually not abiding by the rules of the park. And we see other images, right, throughout American history, recent American history, but then we see the brutal attack or the brutal treatment of George Floyd. And as horrific as this image is, it really is symbolic of the ways that even when African Americans are unarmed and helpless in the face of police and their counterparts, that, this idea that their lives don't matter continues to be the resounding idea that really permeates through a lot of this violence. And then again, Mr. Singleton is going to talk about, some of the other victims of police violence in recent history, but even Breonna Taylor, who was murdered in her home while sleeping after a no-knock warrant went awry and was shot 8 times. And her police officers have still not been arrested. And it's been 111 days since that occurred. And so, when we think about these issues and we think about the way these disparities continue to show up and are exacerbated in the middle of this pandemic, as much as I feel as if now Americans are more engaged, I think it's still easy to be disconnected from these disparities and to feel as if they don't necessarily impact us and they don't necessarily impact the people that we know. But I would just like to say that they not only impact the people that live here in Cincinnati and that many that we know, they've impacted people like me. So in the past 3 months alone, I have experienced my fair share of tragedy like so many other Americans. I have been furloughed. I have experienced the passing of my grandmother who contracted COVID-19 while residing in a nursing home. I've been horrified by ongoing police violence. And whereas this would typically seem like a silver lining on an otherwise dark cloud, I started a new position that I'm really enjoying, but I had to do so remotely while quarantined. So I haven't been able to connect with my colleagues in the way that I typically would. And as you can imagine, this has weighed on my mental and even physical health at times. And so when we think about these issues and we couch them as, these abstract ideas, let's remember how they are truly impacting those of us in our local community, and also what is really at stake if we do not address them. So now that we've addressed where we are, right, in the midst of this pandemic, in the midst of ongoing police violence, it's really important that we explore how we got here. And so we really want to start by exploring things from the beginning, right? And I think that sometimes as racial justice advocates, we do ourselves a disservice when we fail to think about things as beginning even before slavery began. And so I'm going to just capture the essence of perhaps what was truly lost in the context of slavery with a passage from LaRon Bennett Jr.'s book, Before the Mayflower. And it reads, European penetration and the slave trade debased much that was vital in African culture. The popular myth depicts the conquering white man carrying the blessings of civilization to naked savages who sat under trees, filed their teeth, and waited for fruit to drop into their hands. The truth is less flattering to the European ego. On the west coast of Africa, from whence came most of the ancestors of American Negroes, there were complex socioeconomic institutions. Political institutions ranged from extended family groupings to village states and territorial empires. Most of these units had all the appurtenances of the modern state, armies, courts, and internal revenue departments. Indeed, more than one scholar has paid tribute to the legal genius of the African. Anthropologist Melville J. Herskovits has said, of the areas inhabited by non-literate peoples, Africa exhibits the greatest incidence of complex governmental structures. Not even the kingdoms of Peru and Mexico could mobilize resources and concentrate power more effectively than could some of these African monarchies, which are more to be compared with Europe of the Middle Ages than referred to the common conception of the primitive state. And so that passage really just captures, the essence of African culture before the advent of slavery and colonization, which really illustrates why this becomes the original sin against Africans and African Americans in this country. So from 1619 to 1865, Africans enslaved here in America toiled under the weight of chattel slavery. And here you see images of advertisements for people as if they were merely property. And we see the true brutality and the scars of the man in the middle of this slide. And so, we really want to just take a moment to grapple with what occurred, but honestly, what was lost in the midst of slavery and its impact here on African Americans. And in addition, then, we want to move on to this idea that after slavery, there began a cycle of consistent progress and retrenchment. And so I want to thank Judge Black for suggesting that we include the next video to really help illustrate, what is the true impact of this consistent cycle of progress and retrenchment. And just for a bit of context, the video will begin with the speaker, Kimberly Jones, acknowledging or responding to criticism of looters in the context of the most recent uprisings that have occurred here in America.
We're not focusing on why they're doing. And some people are like, well, those aren't people who are legitimately angry about what's happening. Those are people who just want to get stuff. Okay, well then let's go with that. Let's say that's what it is. Let's ask ourselves why in this country in 2020, the financial gap between poor blacks and the rest of the world is at such a distance that people feel like their only hope and only opportunity to get some of the things that we flaunt and flash in front of them all the time is to walk through a broken glass window and get it. That they are so hopeless that getting that necklace, getting that TV, getting that change, getting that bed, getting that phone, whatever it is that they're going to get, is that in that moment when the riots happen and if they present an opportunity of looting, that's their only opportunity to get it. We need to be questioning that why. Why are people that poor? Why are people that broke? Why are people that food insecure, that clothing insecure, that they feel like their only shot, that they are shooting their shot by walking through a broken glass window to get what they need? And then people want to talk about, well, there's plenty of people who pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and got it on their own. Why can't they do that? Let me explain to you something about economics in America. And I'm so glad that as a child, I got an opportunity to spend time at Push where they taught me this, is that we must never forget that economics was the reason that black people were brought to this country. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Do you understand that? That's what we came to do. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Now, if I right now decided that I wanted to play Monopoly with you, and for 400 rounds of playing Monopoly, I didn't allow you to have any money, I didn't allow you to have anything on the board, I didn't allow for you to have anything. And then we played another 50 rounds of Monopoly, and everything that you gained and you earned while you were playing that round of Monopoly was taken from you. That was Tulsa, that was Rosewood. Those are places where we built black economic wealth, where we were self-sufficient, where we owned our stores, where we owned our property, and they burned them to the ground. So that's 450 years. So for 400 rounds of Monopoly, you don't get to play at all. Not only do you not get to play, you have to play on the behalf of the person that you're playing against. You have to play and make money and earn wealth for them, and then you have to turn it over to them. So then for 50 years, you finally get a little bit and you're allowed to play, and every time that they don't like the way that you're playing, or that you're catching up, or that you're doing something to be self-sufficient, they burn your game. They burn your cards. They burn your Monopoly money. And then finally at the release and the onset of that, they allow you to play and they say, okay, now you catch up. Now at this point, the only way you're going to catch up in the game is if the person shares the wealth, correct? But what if every time you share the wealth, then there's psychological warfare against you to say, oh, you're an equal opportunity hire. So if I played 400 rounds of Monopoly with you and I had to play and give you every dime that I made, and then for 50 years, every time that I played, if you didn't like what I did, you got to burn it like they did in Tulsa and like they did in Rosewood, how can you win? How can you win? You can't.
So that very passionate expression of the history of progress and retrenchment in this country, described as a rigged game of Monopoly, really illustrates the struggle that has occurred in this country, essentially beginning as soon as slavery was abolished. And so when we think about the ways that the law has been involved in this progress and retrenchment, we think about that immediately before slavery was abolished, the Dred Scott case, where the Supreme Court held that the U.S. Constitution was never intended to grant citizenship to Black Americans. And my apologies if my thumbnail is covering anything. I'm afraid I cannot see it, but I also just I'll go ahead and just discuss everything that's on this slide briefly. And then we think about, so once slavery was finally abolished after the advent of the Civil War, and the final slaves were informed in Galveston, Texas, we also want to look at the way the Reconstruction Amendments were really ratified in order to implement the change and grant the citizenship that was denied in the Dred Scott case. But of course, we know the Reconstruction Amendments also came hand in hand with the Reconstruction period, which of course ended in 1877. And so between the years of 1877 and 1896, or even 1954, right, we see that the abolition of slavery and the guaranteeing of equal protection, and also the right to vote regardless of race, were really compromised by this domestic terrorism, like the race riots in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that Kimberly acknowledges, which really represented a backlash to this progress within even segregated Black communities in America. And then we look at the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, right, that determined that separate facilities in public and private spaces were not inherently unequal. But of course, the Supreme Court finally overturned that decision in 1954. But even then, there was repression and retrenchment in the context of integrating schools and other public accommodations. And so the civil rights laws, were also there and meant to implement some of this change and grant the citizenship rights. But again, when we think about the rise of mass incarceration in the 70s that will be discussed during David's presentation, we really see how there's been this constant back and forth in this country. But the next speaker, the next video, I think you will all recognize the speaker. And again, I'll thank Judge Hopkins for suggesting this video to be included today. But it also, I think, really captures perhaps why this progress, this cycle of progress and retrenchment continues to occur.
But isn't that part of the dilemma now? That people knew that Negroes were being denied what was guaranteed to them by the Constitution, by the fact that they were citizens of this country. Then when they were given those rights, do you feel the white community said, well, we've given them all that we have, now it's up to them?
Well, I think the dilemma is much deeper, and I think one during this period of transition has to be very honest with America. And honesty impels me to admit that America has broad racist elements still alive. Racism is still existing in American society in many areas of the society, North and South. And the other thing is that there has never been a single, solid, determined commitment of large segments of white America on the whole question of racial equality. I think we have to see that vacillation has always existed, ambivalence has always existed, and this to me is the so-called white backlash. It's merely a new name for an old phenomenon. I see the white backlash as a continuation of the same ambivalence and vacillation of white America on the whole question of racial justice that has existed since the founding of our nation. I think the other thing that we must see at this time is that many of the people who supported us in Selma, in Birmingham, were really outraged about the extremist behavior toward Negroes. But they were not at that moment, and they are not now, committed to genuine equality for Negroes. It's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee an annual income, for instance, to get rid of poverty for Negroes and all poor people. It's much easier to integrate a bus than it is to make genuine integration a reality and quality education a reality in our schools. It's much easier to integrate even a public park than it is to get rid of slums. And I think we are in a new era, a new phase of the struggle, where we have moved from a struggle for decency, which characterized our struggle for 10 or 12 years, to a struggle for genuine equality. And this is where we're getting the resistance, because there was never any intention to go this far. People were reacting to Bull Connor and to Jim Clark rather than acting in good faith for the realization of genuine equality.
All right, so in this video, which I should note was filmed just 11 months before Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, it really captures the essence of what a lot of us that have been advocating for racial justice have come to recognize and lament. This idea that there has never been a true, genuine commitment to substantive racial equality between the races, but instead really an outcry against some of the extremist behaviors that we see. So in the instance of George Floyd's, heinous murder, it's the extremist behavior of Derek Chauvin and his police his fellow police officers that has really infuriated white Americans and Black Americans alike, but that it's the lack of a genuine commitment to then move beyond that frustration with just those extreme manifestations of racial discrimination, but really to rid society of the more insidious ways that racism affects us. So now that we've addressed, the ways that, this slavery and its dehumanization of Black people, and then a cycle of progress and retrenchment have really led to where we are in our nation and our city's history. I think it's also important for us to acknowledge the way that technology and media have really contributed to creating this watershed moment, and has consistently done that. And so, when we think about the 1960s and the 1950s here in America, sorry about that, Siri is picking me up. So when we think about the 1950s and 1960s, we remember these images, right, of these over-militarized police forces that once again we're seeing in the context of the ongoing Black Lives Matter movement, really illustrate the nature and what truly is at stake when we're fighting for racial justice. This idea that, no matter how unarmed and peaceful protesters are, they will be met with this militaristic response. And although they will be outgunned, right, they will not be outhoped in the struggle for racial justice. And so now, especially in the midst of this pandemic, when so many of us are captivated by the 24-hour news cycle, we want to really think about how we can capitalize on the technology and media to continue to build this momentum. So now that we've discussed the ways that we, really just a primer, I should remind us all of really how we got to this point, and particularly where we are. And again, I implore us all to continue that educational process, particularly with the resources that have been provided with today's materials. But then it's time for us to really, particularly allies who don't identify as Black or as people of color, to really take this opportunity to listen. Now more than ever, activists and victims and survivors of discrimination are owning their narrative and using the media to do so. And it's really given us an opportunity to really learn about the impact of racial discrimination in our society. And so if we do as Judge Black suggests, and really take that opportunity, particularly as lawyers, but also as individuals, to just listen in this moment, I think we will all benefit, and particularly as lawyers who are, critical thinkers and so well positioned to argue that this is just, quite frankly, not the time to do that, especially as allies of the movement. And then once we've taken the opportunity to educate ourselves and to really listen to the stories that define this movement, then we want to engage, and we want to do so in a thoughtful and solution-oriented way. We want to facilitate dialogue amongst our family and friends, particularly those who don't necessarily sympathize with the Black Lives Matter movement, although we see this increasing almost permissibility to be anti-racist in society today, and a greater alignment with the movement. But then we also want to think about the ways that we can align, and I will go into this further when we talk about other organizations, but engage through the organizations that we're a part of. But I think particularly while we're still in many ways self-quarantining, I think we want to think about how we can continue to use virtual platforms like today's webinar, but then also social media to our advantage. And so this is really a compilation of some of the illustrations that have been circulated on what many of us would consider a household staple, Ben and Jerry's social media. So while you might not oftentimes consider them to be a champion of racial justice, they have really taken it upon themselves to illustrate in a way that really makes these conversations about racial justice and perhaps some policy reforms accessible to individuals, particularly through social media. And so now when we see social media being weaponized by trolls, if you will, I think for those of us who are advocates, really seeing how we can use it as a tool for good, to really facilitate this dialogue, and not so much as dumb it down, but really make it accessible. And I think these illustrations do a great job of doing that for some really often difficult conversations that are necessary to have. And so once we've engaged, we've committed to engaging, then we want to make sure that we're doing so in order to really maximize our potential as individuals by aligning with other like-minded individuals and organizations, particularly those that already exist. when it comes to racial justice, I think sometimes we're inclined to reinvent the wheel, but we know, and as much change, still needs to happen. And of course, we want to find ways to be creative and optimistic in this moment. We definitely don't want to discount and trivialize the work that is being done. So right here in this community, we have so many organizations that are really championing the cause of racial justice, both within our profession and beyond. And they really present opportunities for us to, particularly allies, get involved with individuals who have firsthand experienced racial discrimination, and have really committed their lives to solving this collective problem. So definitely take an opportunity. And again, this is not an exhaustive list of organizations or compilation of them, but these are some that I think we can all agree have been reliable and at the forefront of these issues within our profession and beyond. And then I just want to make a note. Mike mentioned briefly during the introduction that while I was in law school, one of the things I'm most proud of was being the president and a member of the Women of Color Collective, which when I started law school did not exist. It had at one point on our campus and elsewhere, but it had gone dormant in the years since. And so, as an active member of the Black Law Students Association, and other organizations on campus, I really saw there was a void when it came to issues that particularly impacted women of color. And so that organization really became a coalition of affinity group women to really amplify some of the issues that we felt weren't being addressed, but then we could also build coalitions with those existing organizations. So even when you start something new, make sure that you're still drawing on the power of these other organizations. And I also want to mention, it's an election year. And so right now, I would like to think that anti-racism and racial justice is not a partisan issue. So really finding ways to engage with your political parties and other folks that identify with your political party around these issues. Using this year, right, and the platform presented by an impending election to really champion these issues. So next, we want to discuss really leveraging our power. So we're educating ourselves, we're listening, we're engaging, and we're aligning with organizations, but we also want to make sure that we're leveraging our power within our particular organizations and our firms, right? And so when we think about talking about racial discrimination and how it plays out, particularly in the workplace, we often talk about the privilege that it grants to people and the unfair advantage caused by racial disparities and racial discrimination. And so we want to, not just, again, feel guilty or ashamed of this privilege, but then to see how we can leverage it for good. And I also just want to point out that, white professionals and white people aren't the only people who have privilege and who have power. A lot of times Black and professionals of color have an opportunity and access to power by virtue of some of their academic and professional achievements. So I implore us all, no matter how we identify, to really look at ways that we can leverage that power within those organizations. All right. And so this is just an illustration of how that often plays out, right? That privilege, particularly in the law firm environment where you have a white male dominated space, oftentimes that's being challenged with diversifying its workforce and not necessarily relating to candidates. And so for those who do sympathize and empathize with the racial justice movement, to really see how you can champion those candidates, is very impactful. I know there are many partners and senior attorneys here on recruitment committees, and really finding ways to take this fight into those spaces. All right, so something that I think is often overlooked in terms of racial justice and the fight for racial justice is this idea that, in the midst of all of our fighting, we have to also remember to celebrate Black people, communities, and culture. And so, one of the greatest tragedies of slavery is this idea that it relied on stereotypes about who Black people and communities were in order to justify their criminalization and their stigmatization for generations, right? And so when we think about celebrating Black people and communities and culture, let's also see it as a way to really combat these stereotypes and really allow for people of color to define themselves. I think a very familiar corporate entity, I think has really demonstrated how we can do that.
I'll tell you already. But just like life, All right.
Air Jordan, ready to air you on.
Can I get an amen?
And welcome to the very first National Oprah Winfrey Show!
We'll be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls and sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
So I'm not sure if you all recognize that, but that was actually Google's Black History Month campaign this past year. And I don't know about you, but I really couldn't help but watch that without brimming with pride, not only as a Black person and a Black woman, but also as an American, right, who really wants to celebrate the true diversity of our nation. And in order to do so, that includes celebrating Black people, communities, and culture. And in doing so, we also complete the story that is left untold by stereotypes that define Black and Brown communities. And so now that we have, championed the cause of racial justice in all the ways that we've discussed today, I think it's so imperative that we remember to be bold in our actions. I think that I would be remiss not to acknowledge the ways that we take a risk when we champion these causes. And even though nowadays we see more of an overwhelming commitment or at least acknowledgement of the way race defines our experience, we are still burdened with the reality that championing racial justice oftentimes comes along with risking not just relationships and opportunities, but also our lives. And so this collage is really just a compilation of individuals throughout history who have really taken on the cause of racial justice in very bold and also strategic ways. And while they weren't always rewarded by these things in ways that you could, measure, right, in tangible ways, that I think the integrity and the sense of pride and seeing the progress that does occur in society when we fight for change is reward enough. So let's just always remind ourselves of that. And then I just want to say, particularly in professional spaces, Melody Hobson, an American investor and the former chairwoman for DreamWorks Animation, she coined the phrase color brave, particularly in professional spaces. And I think now, I'm sure I'm not the only person that's been surprised by the way even LinkedIn has become a forum for these conversations. So really taking advantage of this moment to be bold in our activism and our championing of this cause, and understanding that we have to be in it for the long haul in order to affect meaningful change. So, now that we've addressed all the 7 ways that we, particularly as individuals who happen to be lawyers, can champion racial justice in our daily lives, hopefully we are inspired, by, this sobering account of history, but also the prospect of really celebrating Black people, communities, and culture, and feel empowered to be bold in our efforts. Thank you all so much again for your attention today. And please feel free to contact me personally to engage around these issues. As a true millennial, I've shared my social media if you feel so inclined to connect with me in that way. But the struggle for racial justice continues, but I am really inspired by all of our ongoing commitment and interest. Thank you.
Is Rich on as well?
Yes, Judge, I'm on. I'm sorry, I'm starting my camera back up here.
Okay. I'll let you lead off, Rich.
Sure, thank you. Good morning, and as my video hopefully restarts, Amber, thank you for that powerful presentation. We appreciate your words and your commitment to this process. I want to just kind of start off by just giving a kind of brief background of what kind of motivated me to get involved in this program. You know, one of the most memorable things I remember about the lockdown as I'm working from home was my son heading out to protest after the murder of George Floyd. And I was thinking to myself, you know, what can I do? I mean, that young man at 18 felt driven to go out into the streets, but what can I as a lawyer do? As Amber pointed out, we went to law school thinking, many of us, you know, what can we do to solve problems? And here we have a huge problem of our time. And I think for those of you who have taken the time to join us today, you share in this commitment to this question of what can we do to help address these problems. David Singleton, who will be introduced by Judge Bergeron shortly, has been at the tip of the spear of these issues for some time. And we have asked him to join us to give some insights to help us answer that question. And here to introduce Mr. Singleton is Judge Pierre Bergeron of the First District Court of Appeals of Hamilton County. Judge Bergeron.
Thanks, Rich. Before I introduce David, I just want to share a couple of thoughts. I really enjoyed Amber's presentation, and one of the things I wanted to do was just to encourage everyone to think about how you can use your talents, your connections, your interest to effectuate positive change. It's just another way of saying leverage your power, as Amber did. And I think for me personally, what I did as I was struggling, as Rich indicated, of what do I do, is I made a list. And that list had a variety of things on it, some of which are easy to accomplish, others which are challenging. And I'd encourage you to think about that too, but also to put things on that list that are difficult, that are challenging, because this is not a moment to be timid. This is not a moment for modest goals. And one of the things that I found very helpful as I look at this list, I'm almost overwhelmed by it, is just to start talking to other people about it. And what I've accomplished through that is finding other people that have similar interests, that are working on similar projects. And suddenly I'm like, oh, I can help out with this. I don't have to do it all myself. And so I've reached out to those people and said, how can I help? And so I think you may surprise yourself if you start going down that road at the doors that may open up and the other people that you will see out there that are working in the same direction. So that's my editorial comment. So excited that David is joining us today. I've known David for a long time. He graduated from Harvard Law School, is a professor at Chase College of Law. He's been there for over a decade. That's his day job. He moonlights as the executive director of the Ohio Justice and Policy Center. And as Rich said, I mean, he's at the tip of the spear on all of these issues related to criminal justice reform. He has had a front row seat to see all of this. So I think there's really no one that I would find better suited to talk about some of these issues. So David, take it away.
Thank you, Judge Bergeron. I want to begin by echoing what Amber Smith said in terms of thanking all of those involved in putting on this important program. Thank you to the co-conveners. Thank you to BLAC and the CBA. Thanks to all of you who are tuning in. And Amber, I got to give you a special shout out. That was one of the best presentations I've ever seen. And my only criticism is that you made me feel old by calling me Mr. Singleton. I know I've got a lot of gray, but you can call me David. I'll call you Amber. We'll be good. And you're so good at using technology to tell stories in your presentation. I wish I had that skill. Maybe you can teach me that. But I'll let that all slide because your A+ presentation makes up for it. And what I want to do is dive deeper into the issue of the criminal legal system. You all heard Amber say something that was very important, and I just want to just lift it up for a second. Today, a lot of people are thinking about racial equity and racial injustice, primarily because of what happened to George Floyd. But the problems of race and racism in our country go so much deeper and touch every system. In fact, the reason why my work exists at the Ohio Justice and Policy Center, we are all about working in the criminal legal space. The reason we have to do it is because of racism in every other system. I'm thinking about how the people I serve have gotten screwed in terms of the healthcare system. Education, particularly, when we think about why there are so many Black and brown people who are pushed into the criminal legal system because of failing schools. The lack of opportunity, meaningful opportunity to get jobs that pay a living wage, and being discriminated against in terms of getting the better jobs. Those things all matter. But I'm going to focus on the criminal legal system for a moment, because that is in part why we're having this conversation. And frankly, if I got to be honest, it's what I know. I was a public defender for years in New York City and then Washington, D.C. before coming here to Cincinnati in 2001. And since 2002, I have done nothing but get up in the morning and go to bed at night thinking about how to make our criminal legal system better. And just a note on the language. You've heard me say criminal legal system several times now, and you also heard Amber say that as well. I will not say criminal justice system anymore, because the system is not just. If you are rich, you get different outcomes than if you are poor. If you are white, you get better outcomes than if you are Black in the criminal legal system. Until that changes, it's not just. We can work towards justice, but we're not there yet. So I want to share my screen. Just hang on with me for 1 second here. Oops, we go back. Okay, so race, the criminal legal system, and what you as a lawyer can do. And like Amber, I think before we get to, and I promise I'm gonna get to, concrete specific things that we can do as lawyers in the criminal legal system space. I'll get there. But I gotta set the table first, because we can't talk about what to do without having a deeper understanding of what the problems are. So let's first talk about the prison system. A lot of people today are focused, rightfully so, on police brutality. I'll get there later in my presentation. But there are lots of other deep-seated problems in our system that touch on and involve race and racism. So I want to start by talking about how many people we lock up in the United States. 2.3 million people are incarcerated. Let's see if I can move my thumbnail. Okay, 2.3 million people locked up in the United States. Just ponder that for 1 second, what that means. Some of you who may not be as familiar with this number may think, okay, well, so what? What does that mean compared to other places in the world? Well, let's talk about that. The US versus the world. There's the United States incarcerating over 700 people per 100,000. We lead Russia, South Africa, Poland, England and Wales, and China. China! Think about that. We lead the world. In the United States, we represent, our total population represents 5% of the world's population, and yet 25% of the incarcerated population. China's 3 times bigger than the United States, and yet has 3/4 of the folks in prison than we do. It wasn't always that way. This chart makes that point crystal clear. Starting in the 80s, our prison population grew by over 500%. It's starting to level off and come down a little bit now, but look at that exponential growth. And that's for the entire United States. Let's talk for a second about Ohio, because that's where we are. Let's talk about our state. And let's use Martin Luther King milestones to put this in perspective. Dr. King was born in 1929 when we had 8,000 people locked up in our state prison system. In 1955, he led the Montgomery bus boycott. We had about 10,000 prisoners at that time in the state of Ohio. 1963, I should have a poll and ask you what happened in 1963. Well, it's the most famous Martin Luther King speech on the Mall, I Have a Dream speech. We had about 11,000 people locked up in our prison system in Ohio. 1968, April 4th, Dr. King is assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. We've got about 10,000 people locked up. Went back down to 10,000. 1978, 10 years after King's death, we had 12,000 people locked up in our prison systems statewide. And just so you know, we had 10 prisons. So 12,000 people in 10 prisons. In 2002, when I started as executive director at OJPC, we had ballooned our prison population at that point to 35,000 people in 32 institutions. And today, we've got 45,000 people locked up in 32 institutions. 45,000. And we've been as high as 50. And part of the reason we've come down just a little bit is because of the COVID crisis. So what's the impact of prison overcrowding? Well, this is something I know a lot about. Unfortunately for me, not having been incarcerated. So I've got to always remind myself that I don't really know what I'm talking about because I haven't lived it. It's important to listen to people who've lived it. But I have represented in my work at OJPC lots of people who are incarcerated, put into cages in Ohio prisons, and in some instances treated like they are less than the human beings that they are. Medical care is hard to come by in prison because of all the overcrowding. And by the way, just to give perspective, we've got 45,000 people locked up in our state prison system in a system that's designed for 37,500. And we've got the overcrowding leads to violence. It leads to shortage of programming. It leads to, as I said earlier, lack of or sufficient medical care. In the age of COVID, oh my goodness, we were all, as people who cared about incarcerated human beings, on the eve of COVID taking hold in the prisons, we spent all of our time trying to figure out what are we going to do about it. And tragically, 77 people have lost their lives as of today. Over 5,000 prisoners have tested positive for COVID. There's probably many, many, many more who are positive. 2 prisons, Pickaway and Marion Correctional, turn out to be, at one point, the hottest spots in the country for the spread of COVID. The point is when you put people into prisons and there's no way to socially distance, you've got a recipe for disaster in terms of the spread of communicable disease. So all of that, and many more things I'm just not going to get into for the sake of time, are the result of prison overcrowding. So I'm sure you're thinking at this point, all right, so what? What does this have to do with race? We're here to talk about race, and we are. Everything I have said so far has to do with race, and here's why. 1 in 3. 1 in 3. 1 in 3 African American men can expect to go to prison in their lifetime, compared to 1 in 17 for white men, 1 in 6 for Latinos. Black women also get hit hard on this front too. 1 in 18 will spend time in prison at some point in their life, compared to 1 out of 111 for white women. I am lucky. I have never been incarcerated. I've never been to prison. But my brother has in California. So the 1 in 3 number really resonates with me, and it should wake us all up to this the problem of race in our criminal legal system. Some might be thinking at this point, all right, well, isn't the disparity here not really the disparity because Black people commit more crime? Let's just be honest about what some of you may be thinking. And certainly with respect to drug crimes, you saw the slide that Amber put up. That is absolutely not true. Blacks and whites use drugs at the same rates as each other. And yet, if you are Black or brown, you are far more likely to have a criminal legal system contact, to be arrested, to be put into the system, than you are if you are white. Let me bring it into light in a different way. And I'm sorry to call out neighborhoods in our area, but we all know, my daughter knows this by going to school. When she was at Walnut Hills, she'd go to school with kids, white kids from Indian Hills, who would talk all the time about drug use, parties that they had on weekends. Those kids were not getting locked up. They weren't having any contact with the police. And yet, some of the kids that I've gotten to represent in, let's say, Avondale, and they're using drugs, are hauled into the system. It's just fundamentally unfair. And with regard to violent crime, well, guess what drives that? Skin color doesn't drive that. A lot of that is poverty. A lot of that's lack of opportunity. I'm not going to say all of it is, but a lot of it is. And so when we think about why these numbers are the way they are, a lot of it has to do with bias, unconscious and overt bias, conscious bias. And a lot of it has to do with systemic forces that drive certain segments of our community into the criminal legal system. I mentioned 1 in 3 is the number nationally for if you are likely to be in the criminal legal system based on race, and 1 in 3 for Black people. In Ohio, Black folks make up 12% of the overall population, yet 43% of those in our jails and prisons. I'm just letting that hang for a second. 12% of the overall population, 43% of the jail and prison population. And let's not stop there. What happens when you get a criminal record? Well, as the picture indicates, there's going to be a whole lot of problems that come from being convicted of a crime. At this point, when I do a presentation like this live, I always ask the audience, and I could have done this as a poll question, but I chose not to, and we'll have a couple of other poll questions in a sec. But I always ask the room, how many laws do you think are on the books in the state of Ohio that limit your ability to work in a certain field or industry or to hold a professional license? How many laws do you think exist in our state? And I'll call on people because people are shy. They don't want to raise their hand. I'll call on people, and invariably it starts with maybe 10, 15. Somebody might get brave and go up to 50, and then somebody's feeling really brave and bold, and they'll say, "Well, I think maybe 100." Wrong, 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 and wrong. Over 900 laws exist in the state of Ohio that limit or completely shut people out of the opportunity to work in certain fields, hold certain jobs, get certain licenses if they have a felony or misdemeanor record. You could be denied a barber's license in the state of Ohio because of a felony record. And that might be the one thing, because of cuts in programming in prison, that might be the one thing you learn how to do is cut hair, and you could be denied a barber's license based on a felony record. If you've got a felony record and let's say you want to take, you want to one day have your own construction company, guess what? You have no chance of ever doing that because you're barred from getting a license to own a construction firm if you've got a felony record. This is what has led author Michelle Alexander of The New Jim Crow. And if you haven't read that book, please read it. It will help you understand the racism in our criminal legal system. But she talks about how this form of legal discrimination, meaning the right of employers to say they're not going to hire people based on felony record or criminal record, is a way of basically discriminating against Black and brown people, because we shove them into the criminal legal system by racism and other aspects of society, and then they get a record, and then they are left out of opportunities to get on their feet and be productive. It's the Kimberly Jones mantra. How can I win? How can I win? How can I win? You can't when there are all these roadblocks put up on you. And if you are Black and brown, you are more likely to be in the criminal legal system. You're more likely to get a criminal conviction, and then you're more likely to be shut out of the opportunity to work and feed your family. This is in your materials, but if you ever want to look at the collateral consequences that Ohio has, we started a database here at OJPC. You can search by conviction type or a conviction to see what people are excluded from doing based on their conviction, or you can search by license or the occupation that someone wants to do, and you can find out whether they are prohibited from doing it based on a certain conviction. It's a very useful tool and illuminates the problem. All right, poll number 1. This should be pretty easy, folks, since I just talked about it. All right, almost got there. Almost got 100%. 1 and 3. 1 and 3 is the right answer there. And it's a tragedy that that's the right answer. Okay, so why? Well, I talked a little bit about that a second ago, but I want to take this just a little bit deeper and more specific with regard to one particular problem. And the war on drugs, particularly the war on crack cocaine. Many, I'm sure the millennials in the room will not remember the name Len Bias. He was, or actually they won't know because they weren't born, but maybe they know. Len Bias, by the way, did not use crack cocaine. He was a University of Maryland basketball superstar who died of a powder cocaine overdose. He's African American. He had been drafted by the Boston Celtics, and he had the potential to be a Michael Jordan level player. Well, folks, elected officials in Washington seized on his death and actually led the public to believe that Len Bias had died of crack cocaine because there was this picture being painted of folks who use crack as black and from the inner city, and used that to pass the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which I'll get to just a slide in a second about just how draconian the sentences were for people convicted of crack. I'll get there, but all of the discourse around crack cocaine, it was all punitive focused. There was no talk of, or very little talk of, treatment. It was punishment, punishment, punishment. And the folks who had crack problems, and by the way, white people use crack too, and by some estimates used it just as much as black people did. But the face of the crack cocaine epidemic in the US in the 80s and 90s was black. And folks were demonized who used it, called crackheads. We referred to children, little babies born to mothers who were addicted, as crack babies. And all of this failure to see the humanity of people who were addicted to a powerful drug resulted in really harsh punitive approach. People who were dealing crack or possessing, certain quantities of crack in the federal system got hammered. 100-to-1 sentencing disparity for crack versus powder cocaine. What does that mean? You possess 5 grams of crack and you're going to get the same minimum sentence as someone who possesses 500 grams of powder cocaine. The face of someone who used powder cocaine, in many people's view, was a white face. And you'll hear people say, well, the reason why we came down so hard on crack was that it was associated with street violence and we just had to, do this to protect the public. Yeah, you're not going to completely convince me of that, because it's not completely the truth. The fact is that we have not valued Black and brown people in this country. Let's just own it. It's true. We haven't. We haven't at all. And probably the most powerful evidence of that is the current opioid crisis. Thank goodness we are finally talking about addiction as a public health problem. It's how we should be dealing with it, primarily. And yet, it took white people being impacted for us to get there. And I'm just keeping it real, folks. I remember thinking as a young public defender in Washington, D.C. in the mid-90s, and thinking, why are we just locking people up? And I'm not talking about people who were, like Rayful Edmonds in Washington, D.C., who was the most notorious crack dealer. He deserved to go to jail for some period. I think not for the rest of his life, but I'm not talking about him. I'm talking about folks who I would see come in and go to jail and sometimes prison because they possessed and because they were users. They were not looked at sympathetically. There was no talk of, or at least, we would be advocating for treatment, but judges weren't inclined to do it. And now we're at a different point. I'm glad we're there, but the different response we're getting, because opioid addiction is seen more as a problem that impacts white people. And of course, it impacts Black people too. But I think that's the reason why we have a different response. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't pretend to be the expert on everything. But based on my observation over the past 30 years, it is undeniable, in my opinion, that race plays a substantial role in how we look at people. Are we more likely to demonize someone charged with a crime if they are Black versus white? I think so. That's been my experience. All right. Poll number 2. Okay. 101 is the right answer. 100 to 1. And by the way, just in case you're curious, there was in 2010 something called the Fair Sentencing Act that reduced that disparity, the 100 to 1 disparity, down to 18 to 1, but not retroactively. prospectively only. And I think 18-1 is still too big of a disparity. But in 2018, the First Step Act became law, and it made the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010's reduction of that 100-to-1 disparity. It reduced it down. It made it retroactive. It made the provisions of the Fair Sentencing Act retroactive. And since in the first year of the First Step Act, 2,000 people have gotten sentence reductions as a result of that disparity being applied, or that reduction of disparity being applied retroactively. And 91% of those folks who benefited from the First Step Act, trying to level the playing field a little bit, were African American, were Black. 91%. All right. This is my last slide before I get into what we can do as lawyers in the criminal legal system space. Obviously, police brutality is a problem. That's been what a lot of the discourse is focused on in the past month. I could fill up so many screens with faces of beautiful human beings whose lives were snuffed out at the hands of police officers. People who were unarmed, by the way. And I want to make this point because I think it's something that is crystal clear to me, at least. May not be to you, but it's crystal clear to me. We are complicit as a society in these people's deaths. It's tempting to put it off on the officer, the bad apple officer. But it's not just that bad apple officer. It's the other officers who may be good in some ways. We qualify that because you're not good if you protect people who you know are bad. It's not just the police, but it's other system players. It's the courts. Sorry to say this, judges who are Judge Black, Judge Hopkins, although Judge Hopkins, this isn't your area. But I hope other judges are listening to me. You're also complicit. The Supreme Court's complicit in creating standards that make it really difficult, like qualified immunity, to hold police officers accountable when they do wrong. It's judges who will always believe the police officer who testifies that they recovered evidence a certain way and dismiss out of hand the the other witnesses who come forward to say, no, it didn't happen that way. The officers just came up and started searching the person, and it wasn't the case that the man who was arrested was holding the drugs up in the air. I don't know how many cases I had like that in DC, where police would come in time after time and say, there is no Fourth Amendment violation because your client was holding the drugs up in the air, and we would lose and lose and lose and lose our motions to suppress because the police were presumed to be telling the truth. It's prosecutors who also fail to hold police officers who they should question, but don't, and failure to hold them accountable. It is us as an entire community that doesn't do what Amber said we should do, which is leverage our power and our positions to speak up and speak out. We're all on the hook for this. And it's this rotten culture as a whole that allows Officer Chauvin to think he can get away with murder by kneeling on a man's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds as he pleads for his life. We are all responsible. So what can we do as lawyers? Well, there's a lot we can do as lawyers. And my suggestions are going to focus a lot on the criminal legal system because, number one, that's what I do. And it's also what a lot of people are talking about these days. So I'm gonna focus on that. But please understand that, as Amber said, there are so many different ways we can focus on reducing racism and its impact in our community. There's lots of ways we can do that as lawyers, and just pick a system. Pick a system and you will find racism, and there'll be plenty to do about it. All right. If you have any interest in reducing mass incarceration, come and volunteer at OJPC. We've got this new project we started called Beyond Guilt, and think the opposite of the Innocence Project. Innocence Project does great work, but most people who get sent to prison are not factually innocent. And what this project does is it seeks to free people who are admit guilt, who've been in a significant period of time, and they can demonstrate rehabilitation. We have partnered with the local prosecutor's office. I've worked very, very closely with Steve Tolbert in the prosecutor's office, and we freed a bunch of people in Hamilton County, including people who were serving time for murder, and they had not even served the minimum sentence for parole yet, and we were able to get back into court and get them freed, and they're living productive, law-abiding lives. Is it helpful to be a litigator to do this? Yeah, it's helpful, but it's not required necessarily, because I've got a lawyer that I'll be talking to tomorrow from DC who's a consultant at the World Bank, and she wants to volunteer on a Beyond Guilt case, and she's going to get some research project to do that will help in a particular case. And you can reach out to Mark Vanderlaan, who's now, we stole him away from Dinsmore. He's now our litigation director. You care about what happened with the police arresting, doing the mass arrests at the Cincinnati protests? Contact Jackie Green, who is the point person for the mass defense team for the National Lawyers Guild locally. Contact her. We're part of that effort. She's leading that fight, and contact her. That'd be something that would be meaningful. You want to do work on criminal legal system policy reform? Reach out to me. And my cell phone's on the front of the slides. Reach out to me. Happy to do that. I haven't had a chance to talk yet about bail reform, and we're partnering with others. The local public defender office has really done heroic work. I just want to lift them up on lots of different things, in addition to just defending their clients in court. But they've been super active on bail reform, because the reality is, when bail is set at such a high level that people can't make it and they stay in pre-trial, there's all this pressure for people to plead, and sometimes they plead to things that they didn't do. Sometimes they plead to more than they should plead to. They get longer sentences as a result, and bail exists to just ensure the person's going to return back to court. It's not designed for preventive detention in most cases. And so we've been pushing for locally for judges not to set such high bails sort of across the board, and get involved in that. There's other stuff we're doing in Columbus. I forgot to mention earlier that we have a Columbus office, and we are regularly in the legislature. If you aren't a litigator but want to work on policy stuff, let me know. We'll figure out a way to plug you in. I mentioned the bail fund. Donate to the bail fund. We have a bail fund that's housed at Beloved Community Church, and it helps pay the bail of people who can't afford bail. And, you know, as lawyers, many of us are blessed with income that most people don't make. Donate to the bail fund. That'd be a good way to be helpful. I can't say enough about, if we want to reduce mass incarceration, supporting public defenders and the very difficult work that they do. It's often thankless work. I know I was a public defender in DC and New York, and public defenders often don't get the resources that they need. And Bill Gallagher, a local criminal defense lawyer that I'm sure many of you know, started an organization called Friends to the Indigent, and it raises money to supplement training programs for the local office. And if we have better resourced and better trained public defenders, then the outcomes will be fair, because guess who's primarily seeing, public defenders? It's going to be Black and brown people in our community. And if you want to do something about equalizing the playing field and having a more equitable criminal legal system, then we need to make sure our public defender is well supported. If you care about the impact of collateral consequences is that euphemism for all those litany of laws that keep people out of work if they've got a criminal record. We've got at OJPC legal clinics that we hold throughout the city, where we help folks who are eligible for record expungement get their records expunged. There's this great tool called a Certificate for Qualification for Employment, and it's called a CQE. And what that does is it allows people who have rehabilitated themselves to ask the court to certify that they've been rehabilitated. And the beauty of that is two things. One, if you get a CQE, if there's a mandatory you shall not work in a certain industry law, that gets you out from the mandatory nature of that law, and it becomes discretionary. So that's the first thing it does. The second thing it does is any employer who hires a person with a CQE is shielded from negligent hiring based on the person having a criminal record. You can use your voices and your connections to encourage private employers to hire people with criminal records. That's important. As lawyers, we are respected members of the community. Many of us represent business interests. Encourage them to think about second chance hiring. The Nehemiah manufacturing project in town, Dan Meyer runs that, is a business that exists. It's a manufacturing business that exists to employ people with criminal records. That's a shining example of what we need more of in our community. If you care about police accountability, there are lots of stakeholders that we work with on policy changes. Just contact me. You want to litigate a police brutality case, get in touch with me. And if you're a prosecutor or a judge, hold the police wrongdoers accountable. Don't just swallow whole what a police officer says. And I say that as the son of a police officer, just so you know. And if you care about issues outside of the criminal legal system, identify your passion. As Amber said, find an organization already doing the work that you can partner with. No need to reinvent the wheel. The CBA, the BLAC, the Volunteer Lawyers for the Poor are excellent resources. And go to work. But no matter what you decide to do these two things, and then I'll close. And it's going to echo something that Amber said, but commit to educate yourself more deeply. And I just have a few things up here that are reading resources. One, the very first one is more generally on racism in the United States, but the rest of them are about the criminal legal system and race. And take an implicit bias test, please. We are all walking around with bias. We are. We can't help it. Amber told you why. It's because of the history of this country. We necessarily are impacted, every single one of us, based on race. Every single one of us. We are not colorblind. It is not the reality. Take an implicit bias test. Harvard has several you can take, and learn what your bias is. And hopefully let it inform what steps you take in your individual life to be less biased and less racist. And I'm sorry to say that, but less racist. We all carry around issues of race, and we need to just deal with it honestly. Questions will come later. And I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to present on this panel, and I look forward to the question and answer.
Okay, I'm sorry, Danielle, I can't. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, okay.
Oh, okay, apologies. So my name is Danielle Rickman. I'm an attorney at DBL Law in Northern Kentucky. We are going to open the session now up for some discussion. If you could use the Q&A chat, or if you would like to raise your hand, we'll begin there. And Wednesday also has a poll question that we'll run to get things started as well. So if you have something, feel free to add something in the chat. Okay, so maybe before or while we're doing this question, we do have one here. Any recommendations on how to enlist attorneys or colleagues who do not think this is their problem?
So I will jump in on that because, well, actually that leads to our second poll question about talking to colleagues about race. And actually, I will go ahead and jump to that and just know that that poll question is coming. You know, it is something that is different, obviously, based on where you work and who you work with. But one thing that we have done at the College of Law, and I know the Cincinnati Bar Association has made available, is the 21-day Racial Equity Habit Building Challenge. There is a link to the challenge in the materials. And I know at the College of Law, this has been a starting point for us to start talking about race and just really, you know, have that type of a conversation. You know, it's important to think about not only how to address racist comments, but how to hear from people of color when they are, in fact, sharing their experiences and how they feel about different comments. And so as far as, you know, how to approach that, there are a lot of resources in the 21-day challenge about addressing microaggressions and, you know, how to listen. I think the most important thing is really creating a safe space within the office. I was impressed with something that's happening at Mount Notre Dame. They have implemented a phrase for their students to use when they hear something offensive. The word is pause, which has a double meaning. The meaning means pause, as giving the opportunity for the speaker to think about what was said. And it also is pause after their mascot, the cougar paw, giving the speaker also an opportunity to think about what they said and whether that embodies the character and virtues of a Mount Notre Dame student. So, you know, I think implementing some conversations around race are important to maybe lay a foundation and a framework for employees to feel empowered to, one, know how to respond when they hear things that may be offensive or harmful, but also tasking or equipping individuals who may have made harmful comments to know that it isn't often about intent. It's really about the effect, and that if you are, called out for a harmful comment, that the person that calls you out most likely isn't trying to shame you, but it comes from a place of encouragement to grow, and that we should receive comments, as Amber said, with empathy and grace, and maybe thank our employer or our coworkers as we have these types of conversations. So I think we'll pivot now really quick back to this poll question that we have here. And so this is great. So we see that 74% of the poll, or those who took the poll, said that they have talked about race as a white or Caucasian, and then 15% as non-white individuals taking the poll said that they also have talked about race. So that's a very high percentage, and that's great. So it looks like we are in a great resource of individuals who are comfortable talking about race. That conversation clearly does change based on the age of the children. And again, there's lots of resources. I was impressed recently with a blog from the Cincinnati Children's Hospital that they put out about race. And I think the big takeaway that I want to share with race in children is the importance of not teaching a colorblind approach, but highlighting and celebrating differences. Clearly, as our speakers have talked today, society is not colorblind, and we don't want to pretend that there is no racism and no issues with race. And of course, silence around the message can send, or silence around race can send the message that you're trivializing or minimizing the struggles of marginalized individuals. So I think we have lots of things in the chat. Let's see here.
Yes, we've got a couple things. Someone has encouraged us to check out a series from Crossroads Church called Undivided with lead pastor Chuck Mingo, and I think that's something we could include in some of the resources that we distribute. And Judge Hopkins has a question, what should law firms do to embrace diversity in hiring, retention, and promotion?
So I'll take that, and perhaps it was a softball question to me, Judge Hopkins. My name is Wednesday Shipp, for those of you that I don't know, and I am the president of Black Lawyers Association of Cincinnati and very involved with the Roundtable. The Roundtable has been putting together for some time now with several people in the legal community a program directed to legal employers, and we're getting ready to launch that in the next few months here. We need to re-up our efforts on diversity and inclusion and success rates for African American attorneys in our various legal employers in the community. And so this will be a very targeted program. We want you to, you may be signed up for the Roundtable. We want you to re-sign up, re-engage, recommit, do the exercises with the consultant that we plan to bring in, really take the work away, come back, rehash what worked and what didn't work, and try again. So we have some very deliberate programming coming directed to how to increase not just how many African Americans you're hiring, but the retention rate and the advancement rate as well. Any other questions from the chat? We are short on time, so we're gonna try and get through our chat and our Q&A questions, and then we'll close out, understanding that this is just the first of many discussions in this dialogue, right? This is ongoing discussion. Danielle, is there anything else in the?
There's not.
Q&A?
Not in the Q&A. If there's anything in the chat.
Yeah, I can see something splashing. I don't know what that is.
Okay. Oh, let's see.
Nothing. We'll do one more poll question and then we'll close it out after we discuss this in the interest of time. So the poll question is, how comfortable are you with discussing racism with your work colleagues? And we've already kind of talked about that, Kate, but let's see what the audience says.
And just as folks are, there was one more question in the chat I've just seen. Unfair question, as a Black person, very interested in and passionate about race, how do I avoid becoming the Black voice in majority settings, which I think pairs nicely with this poll question.
All right, so this really is a split, you know, almost even between, you know, those that are completely comfortable and somewhat comfortable, but I'm glad that no one said that they were completely uncomfortable. So that's definitely one positive takeaway there. You know, Michael Hawkins, I want to acknowledge, did mention a book that he suggested that is called Let's Talk About Race. So I wanted to catch that in the comments. So you want to talk about race. Thank you for that, Michael. You know, I think as I mentioned, the 21-day challenge has definitely been a great starting point for us at the law school. Again, my name is Kate Kristoff, and I am a career counselor at the College of Law. And our staff has started that, and it really has started a conversation, and that laid a foundation for a safe space. And I think that's a great starting point if you're really just looking for an entry level, a place to get started and start the conversation, and there are great resources there. And again, you know, I think Amber said it so well with this empathy and grace. I think if we're all coming from it with a place of empathy and grace, it's easier to talk about race and have these types of conversations. You know, we all, as part of this journey, want to listen and share. And I think the preparation is really key. So if we, you know, are taking the steps to think about, you know, how we're going to handle these types of situations, then we can be ready to address them in a way that is calm and meaningful and has the, you know, the impact that we want it to have to really have our coworkers understand where we're coming from and to foster that safe space for sharing and growing as an office and as individuals.
So I want to thank you, Kate, and everyone who's participated. We are at the end of our hour. I do want to answer this question, or try to answer this question that I think many of us face as being African Americans in our office settings. You know, how do I voice my opinion without taking on the burden of trying to represent the whole race? And I think Amber did touch on this earlier, that we do have varying perspectives on things. We also have varying expertise on things. And so I always want to make the point to the people I work with and others that, you know, I had the same history courses that you did, right? So I don't know everything either. I'm trying to educate myself. I am educated from experience, but I'm not necessarily educated from, you know, the expert in diversity and inclusion. And I think how you, you know, to the person's question, how do I avoid being the voice of Black America? I think you start out with that. And I think we're at a point in time where it's fair for you to say, look, this is my opinion, but I'm often concerned about what I say. Now I have to carry the torch for my whole community. There's certain experiences we have that the majority of us will agree on certain things, but it is not my burden to teach everyone about racism, anti-racism, and Black history and American history. And I will give you my opinion, but I encourage you to also go and learn as well. So with that, because we're at the end of our hour, there's another question about voting. Yes, Amber, go ahead.
So just briefly, I did want to address, I see that someone has asked, what can we do to help assure that all people in our community and state are able to easily exercise their franchise and vote in the upcoming election? Again, I'll just implore you all to reach out if this is something you're interested in. Mike mentioned I'm actually serving as the Deputy Director of Voter Protection for the state of Ohio this year with the Democratic Party. But again, when we talk about giving or making sure that we have access to the right to vote, that should be a bipartisan issue. And this year, the Ohio Supreme Court has actually authorized for attorneys to receive CLE credit to serve as poll workers, which is a great way to help ensure the franchise is accessible to the most eligible voters. But of course, we're also pushing this idea of voting by mail in the midst of the pandemic. So educating yourself and others about that process is really essential to making sure that everyone can participate. So again, reach out to me via email. I'll drop it again in the chat, and it's also in the materials that were distributed. Thank you.
Thank you, Amber. And I also say election protection is another place you can go for that. All the Board of Elections have information about poll workers, and in your materials on page 93 is the reading list. Page 100 is a list of action items. So this picks up on additional things beyond what David and Amber spoke about today of things you can do and agencies you can contact. It's in your materials as a handout. Again, we're at the end of our hour, but I just want to thank so many people for participating and for having the interest in, hearing the call to action and taking action. And I wanted, as the president of Black Lawyers Association, I kept getting this question of, what can I do? And I thought, well, first of all, I can't answer 100 individual questions. So let's have a program where we come together. And second of all, I'm not the expert on all things, right? And I don't pretend to be. So let's have a program where we come together and collectively as a community talk about this. And thank you, Amber and David, and the many people that worked with you behind the scenes to give us some very insightful presentations. I think they were helpful. Thank you to those of you who worked with me on that subcommittee to get the list of reading materials and the handout with some actionable items on it, because I wanted people to walk away knowing where they could go to tap into some of the efforts that are already happening. And so if you have read that list or you're reviewing it and you have something else to add, please do that by reaching out to LaDonna Wallace-Smith at the CBA. She's our Director of Community Engagement, I think is the correct title. And we will have a resource page on the CBA's website, and we will update these materials so that you continue to have access to knowing what's going on in the community and where you can engage in. I'll just leave you all with this quote: to bring about change, you must not be afraid to take the first step. We will fail when we fail to try. And that was something that Rosa Parks said, and I just think it still resonates today. The fact that we're on this line, we all want to do something, is great. Now let's go get busy and get it done. So with that, I will close out, and thank you again all for participating. We will have additional programming coming forward, but don't wait for us. Go get busy right now. All right, thanks everyone. Bye-bye.